that it? Oh yeah, I have a question.
Your translation method. I've read interviews with the pair who translate Dostoevsky and Tolstoy novels, and she's Russian, and they live in Great Britain, and she's of Russian origin, and so they take. She makes a literal translation, whatever that means,
yes,
of the Dostoevsky or Tolstoy text. And I can imagine Dostoevsky would be particularly difficult. And then together, they English it.
Yeah.
And I think if you read, say, the Constance Garnett classic translations, early 20th century translations of those novels, and read theirs, they're different worlds. Yeah. The tone that they achieve, all that. So, how do you go? What's your translation method aside from waiting for this moment where something clicks?
I mean, it's very similar. I speak no Urdu, but now I have 70 pages of Urdu poetry I translated with my co-translator. And we go word for word, line by line. It's useful if, as with the ghazal or with classical Chinese poetry, you're dealing with something that's modular. You know, the nice thing about the ghazal is if you can understand the quatrain, not the quatrain, sorry, the couplet, then you know that the other couplets might be slightly related, but pretty much it is its own unit. So it's a small little thing you have to figure out. So the thing you look at is, well, now that we know what it says word for word, I think about what are the power words. By power words, I mean nouns, verbs, and adjectives. And I try and keep those in, and don't worry too much about the lesser words, whether I keep the articles or whether I shift the prepositions around. I want to get the meaning across, but I want to make sure I get the meaning across in such a way that I hit all of the major action words. Then beyond that, I think about the rhetoric of it, and particularly with the ghazal, there's a kind of typically a witty play. If I can get that witty play across, then I think I've done my job. And I have a discussion with my co-translator about that. Once we have the literal translation, we keep on working and working and working until it works in English as a little witty statement that functions the way the ghazal is supposed to work. Very similar in Chinese, because each line is based upon half lines. The caesura, and then each couplet tends to be a unit, and also because the way the Chinese poetry works, typically it was an oral tradition that was later written down, and so there's a pause at the end; it's end stopped. So each line is its own unit. So you can go line by line, and half line by line, line by line, and then couplet by couplet, and quatrain by quatrain, and build up the poem. With longer poems, it's more difficult. But for the 8-line poem, for example, it's not quite as difficult as you might think. Also, of course, there are many other translations of these works, so after we translate them, I'll consult others in case other people have better ideas. And I feel that my general rule is if somebody else has done it better, it's not worth me doing it. And I better go back to work until I feel at least I'm equal with somebody whose work I admire, a Kenneth Rexrother, an Arthur Whaley, or a Burton Watson, or that sounds very egotistical. I mean, but I try to at least be, because they're wonderful translators. But I try to. That's my goal, anyways, to try to measure myself against the great translators and at least try to stand, in the same room with them. So, does that explain it? I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's a hard thing with translation because there's always loss. This is the cliche, that the translator, there's always something lost in translation. In fact, what Robert Frost said of Carl Sandburg was, he's a poet who can only be improved in translation. Kind of a nice, slur. But the thing that's rarely talked about is there's also gain in translation. A cliche in one language, such as her smile is a bow that shoots love arrows at me, which is the most rank cliche in Urdu poetry. It's interesting in English. The night was black as a raven's wings. Kind of interesting in English. Again, a cliche in Indian poetry. The Milky Way, cliche in English. An interesting cliche because it comes with the idea that Hera, Zeus's wife, spilled her breast milk, which became the Milky Way. But okay. We don't know that. We just think the Milky Way is a dead metaphor. In Chinese, the term is the river of heaven. The river of heaven is quite exciting in English, as the Milky Way might be in Chinese. But so in other words, there are things to be gained if you by bringing over different image sets from one language to another. And also there's a lot to be gained by the fact that modes that are very common in one language might not be well known in another language. So the exciting thing about the early translations of Chinese poetry into English by Kenneth Rexroth and Arthur Waley and Ezra Pound and so on is that they're something that very much appealed especially to American poets. The idea that I'm not so much here in California, but I'm a poet living somewhere in the boondocks, and my only contact is through letters to friends who are, so that's something that's very appealing to American poets. I grew up in Indiana where all the poets really felt like they were in exile, and those Chinese poets, living off in Chengdu or somewhere far off from the center felt often the same way, and they wrote about it quite movingly, and it became a very actually powerful subgenre of American poetry simply because we translated the mode into English. So, yeah. Well,
Thank you.
Thank you. Lovely audience.